The morning Ralph Dalton rode into Millhaven, Texas, in the spring of 1882, three different men at the saloon warned him about Louise Ralston before he had even finished his first glass of water. He had not asked about her. He had not even known her name an hour before. But somehow, between hitching his horse at the post outside the Silver Spur and settling onto a barstool with dust still coating the shoulders of his denim jacket, the subject of Louise Ralston had found him like a creek finds the lowest point in a valley, naturally, inevitably, and with a kind of quiet force that made you wonder if it had always been heading that way. "You looking for work?" the barkeep had asked, sliding a glass across the worn pine counter. "Ranch work," Ralph had said simply. "Heard there was a spread east of town looking for hands." That was when the man to his left, a weathered fellow with a silver mustache and sun-darkened skin named Hector Prout, had turned on his stool and given Ralph the kind of look a man gives a stranger who has just announced he plans to walk into a hornet's nest wearing a coat made of honey. "That be the Ralston place," Hector said. "That be the one," Ralph confirmed. Hector let out a long breath. "Well, good luck to you." The man on Ralph's right, who introduced himself as Dale Morrow, a cattle buyer passing through on his way to San Antonio, leaned forward on his elbows and shook his head with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "The Ralston girl runs that place now since her father passed. Margaret Ralston, that's the mother. She's staying with her sister up in Abilene while she recovers from her grief. Leaves the girl entirely in charge." "Girl," Ralph said. "Woman," Dale corrected, though not without some amusement. 24 years old and sharp as a whittled stick. Name's Louise. Now, she's not the problem exactly. She's capable, no question about that. The problem is she was raised in Philadelphia, schooled back east. She came out here because her father needed her, and everyone assumed she'd pack up and sell the land the moment old Earl Ralston put his boots under the earth for good. That was 4 months ago. She is still there." "That sounds like determination to me," Ralph said. Hector made a sound that was half laugh and half warning. "Determination, sure, but she doesn't know the land. She's reading books about cattle ranching, for heaven's sake. She hired 2 men last month, and they quit inside of 2 weeks, because she kept correcting their methods using passages from agricultural manuals. She's stubborn as a post oak and twice as immovable. You'll be out of a job before summer if you take that position." The third man, a quiet fellow named Amos Birch who had been listening from the far end of the bar, spoke up without turning his head. "What Hector's not telling you is that she's also been offered good money for that land by Gideon Farrow, 3 times now, and she's refused every single time." Ralph set down his glass and looked at Amos. "Who's Gideon Farrow?" "The man who owns everything east of the river that isn't nailed down already," Hector said. "And some things that are. He wants the Ralston water rights. That property sits on the best aquifer in the county. Farrow's been circling that land like a buzzard since before Earl even got sick." Ralph was quiet for a moment, turning this information over in his mind, the way a man turns a coin in his fingers to check both sides before he decides if it's real. He had ridden through a lot of country in his 30 years. He had worked ranches in New Mexico, in Colorado, in the hill country of central Texas. He was good at the work. He liked the land, liked animals, liked the particular kind of silence that came with a morning in open country before the world woke up and got complicated. He was not the kind of man who turned away from a job because it came with difficulties attached. "She's still looking for hands?" he asked. "Far as I know," Dale said, "though I'd wager against your chances of lasting the month." Ralph left a coin on the counter, picked up his hat from where he'd set it beside his glass and stood. "I've been told worse odds," he said, and walked back out into the Texas morning. The Ralston spread was about 4 miles east of town, past a line of cottonwood trees that marked the bank of Callaway Creek, and along a rutted road that wound through mesquite brush and shortgrass prairie. Ralph followed the directions Hector had given him, which were simple enough: east on the main road, left at the broken windmill, straight on until you hit the gate with the iron R on it. He found the gate. He found the R he also found as he turned his horse down the long drive toward the house and barn, something he had not at all expected to find. She was in the field, not watching the field. Not standing at the edge of the field with her hands clasped and a worried expression on her face while someone else worked it. She was in the field itself, knee-deep in the tall grass that was coming in thick and wild along the south pasture, and she was working. She had a pair of leather gloves on her hands and a wide-brimmed hat on her head that was just slightly too large for her and kept tilting to one side, and she was pulling at the overgrowth with a kind of focused, methodical fury that was both impressive and slightly alarming to witness. Ralph pulled his horse to a stop and sat for a moment, just watching. She had not heard him yet. The wind was coming from the east, carrying sound away from her toward the hills, and she was making enough noise of her own with the work that a single rider on a quiet road was not enough to interrupt her concentration. She yanked at a long strand of tumbleweed grass, stumbled back half a step when it gave way suddenly, steadied herself, and tossed it to the pile growing behind her. Ralph thought about what Hector Pruitt had told him, that she would never settle for a ranch life, that she was a city woman, an educated woman, a woman who had come west out of obligation and duty and would leave the moment propriety allowed it, that she was reading books about ranching rather than learning it by feel. The woman in the field did not look like she was reading books. The woman in the field looked like she was absolutely, ferociously determined to make something grow. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post at the edge of the drive and walked toward the field. She heard him when he was about 20 feet away. She straightened, turned, and looked at him with an expression that was completely unreadable. She was tall for a woman, with dark brown hair pinned up under that too large hat, and eyes that were a particular shade of hazel that seemed to shift between brown and green depending on how the light caught them. There was a streak of dirt across her left cheekbone that she had clearly not noticed, and her sleeves were rolled to her elbows despite the propriety issues that might have caused back in Philadelphia. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are not sure whether to be glad about or suspicious of. "Are you lost?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Ralph said. "I heard you were looking for ranch hands. I came to apply for the position." She studied him for a long moment. He let her study. He had the kind of face that tended to read as honest, which it was, and the kind of steady way of standing that suggested he was not easily startled or moved, which was also true. He was built for this kind of work, wide through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands that were already the hands of a man who had spent years in hard, whether doing hard labor. "You've done this kind of work before?" she asked. 20 years, counting the years I spent as a boy on my father's property in New Mexico," he said. She pulled off one glove and extended her hand. "Louise Ralston," she said. He shook it. "Ralph Dalton." She looked at the pile of overgrowth she had been accumulating. "I need someone who knows about the south pasture specifically. The drainage is wrong and the grass is coming in thick with weeds mixed in, and I can't get ahead of it by myself. I also need someone who can assess the fencing on the north and east borders, because I think there are gaps and I've had cattle moving more than they should." "I can do both of those things," Ralph said. She looked at him one more time, still with that expression that gave nothing away. Then she pulled her other glove back on. $40 a month, room in the bunkhouse, meals from the main kitchen at 6 and noon and 6. I expect honesty about what you see and what you think needs doing. I also expect that if you disagree with me about something, you'll tell me directly and we'll discuss it rather than you doing it your own way without telling me." Ralph almost smiled. "That's fair," he said. "It is," Louise agreed and turned back to the grass. He stood there for a moment, watching her go back to work. "Should I start now?" he asked. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I have been pulling weeds since 5 this morning. Yes, I think you should start now." He went back to his horse, retrieved his work gloves from the saddlebag, and climbed into the field to join her. They worked side by side through the morning without much conversation. Ralph could tell a great deal about a person from how they worked, And what he learned about Louise Ralston in those first 2 hours was this. She had stamina that most people twice as experienced as her did not have. She was observant enough to notice when his technique for separating weed from grass root was more efficient than hers, and to immediately adopt it without being asked. And she had not the slightest inclination to stop or slow down simply because the work was difficult. At noon, they walked back to the main house in companionable silence, and she pushed open the back door to a kitchen that smelled of cornbread and coffee. She had laid out food before she went out that morning, things that kept cold cornbread, dried beef, a jar of peaches put up from the previous summer that she had found in the cellar. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that was still warm on the back of the iron stove and set one in front of him without asking how he took it. He drank it black. She drank hers with a spoon of molasses stirred in, which was unusual but not unpleasant to observe. "How long have you been at it out there?" he asked, meaning the field. "Since I arrived," she said. "About 10 days ago. I had 2 men hired before that, but they left." He nodded. He did not ask why they left, because he had already been told, and he did not want her to feel he had come to her with a head full of other people's opinions about her. That seemed unfair. "The drainage issue," he said instead. "Have you looked at where the water comes in from the north end? Because if the slope of the land is pulling water from the creek toward the south pasture, that would explain why the grass is coming in waterlogged enough to let the weeds take hold." She set down her coffee cup and looked at him with an expression that was slightly more open than the one she had worn in the field. "I had not considered it from that direction," she said carefully. "I was thinking the problem originated in the soil composition." "It might," he said, "but if the drainage from the creek is adding to it, fixing the soil without addressing the water won't hold." She was quiet for a moment. "I read 2 books on pasture management," she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost defensive but not quite. It was more like the voice of someone who is used to being told that reading is not enough and is bracing for it again. Ralph did not say reading is not enough. He said, "What did they say about drainage?" That surprised her. He could see it in the way her posture changed very slightly from braced to curious. She reached under the table and produced, from a canvas bag hanging on the chair leg, a book with a well-worn spine. She opened it to a page that had been marked with a strip of cloth and turned it so he could see. He leaned over and read the relevant passage. It was accurate as far as it went, but it was general, written for someone managing Midwestern farmland, not Texas hill country with its particular patterns of flash and drought. "The principle is right," he said. "But the application is different out here. The ground doesn't absorb the same way. I can show you what I mean tomorrow morning if you want to walk the north border with me." She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she was measuring him against, apparently he came up to the mark. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning." She showed him the bunkhouse after lunch. It was a small structure, clean, which suggested she had cleaned it herself, with 2 empty bunks and a small iron stove and a single window that looked out toward the east pasture. He set his saddlebag down on the lower bunk and unpacked the few things he traveled with: a change of clothes, his shaving kit, a small journal he kept notes in, a worn Bible he had never been terribly religious about but kept because his mother had given it to him. Louise showed him the barn and the horses and the location of the tools, gave him a brief accounting of where the cattle were pastured and roughly how many head she believed she had, and then returned to the house with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a great many things on her list and intended to address them all. Ralph stood in the barn doorway and looked out at the land as the afternoon light began its long westward slide. The Ralston property was genuinely beautiful, in the particular way that Texas hill country is beautiful, which is not a gentle beauty but a fierce and honest one. The grass moved in the wind like the surface of a slow river. The sky was enormous, the kind of sky you only get when the land is flat enough to let the horizon run out to its full distance. In the far east, just barely visible, he could see the shimmer of water that must be Callaway Creek. He thought about the men in the saloon. He thought about what they had said about her, that she would never settle, that she was out of place, that this was not her world. He thought about the streak of dirt on her cheekbone, and the way she had climbed straight back into the tall grass without a second's hesitation, and he thought that the men in the saloon might be wrong about Louise Ralston. He went to work on the east fence that afternoon and found 3 gaps wide enough for a cow to walk through sideways, and fixed 2 of them before the light gave out. The first week settled into a rhythm that Ralph recognized as the particular cadence of a place that is still figuring out what it wants to be. He rose at 5, fed and watered the horses, and had coffee in the kitchen by 5:30. Louise was always already up, and they developed a quiet habit of drinking that first coffee together at the kitchen table before the day began, exchanging information about what had been done the previous day and what needed doing next. She was not easy conversation. She was precise and direct, and she asked questions that suggested she was thinking very carefully about the answers. But she was not unfriendly. She was interested in everything, and that genuine interest made her a pleasure to talk to once you got past the sharpness of the surface. He showed her the drainage problem on the second day as he had promised. They walked the north border together in the early morning, and he pointed out where the ground dipped toward the south pasture, and how the creek's seasonal overflow was working its way down the natural channel in the land, and pooling in exactly the places where the weeds were worst. She listened to him with the complete attention of someone who understands that they are being given information they did not have before and intends to make use of it. She did not look embarrassed that she had not seen it. She looked interested, and then she looked calculating, and then she said, "So if we redirected the overflow with a shallow berm along the north line of the south pasture, it would change where the water goes." "That's right," he said. "Can we build a berm?" "With enough labor, yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ground with its particular slope and composition. It would need to be at least. She stopped, pulled the book from her canvas bag, and flipped to a different page. She found the relevant passage, read it quickly, and said, "At least 3 feet high and pitched at roughly 15 degrees according to this." Ralph looked at the page. "That's for clay soil," he said. "Here you'd want closer to 2 feet but twice the base width. The sandy composition means a taller, narrower berm won't hold." She looked at the page. She looked at the ground. She looked at him. "You're right," she said simply, and put the book away. It was that simple acknowledgement, given without resistance or embarrassment, that made Ralph begin to understand that the men in the saloon had been measuring Louise Ralston against the wrong scale. She was not a city woman playing at ranching. She was an intelligent woman learning as fast as she could something she had not been taught, and doing it with an honesty about her own knowledge gaps that most people, man or woman, experienced or knew, did not have. They started on the berm at the end of the first week, hauling earth from the slightly higher ground to the west and packing it into a low, wide wall along the north edge of the south pasture. It was brutal work in the April heat, which was already more than it had any right to be. Ralph did the heavy shoveling and Louise directed, though she also shoveled, which he had not expected, and which impressed him more than he let on. On the Thursday of his second week, a rider came down the drive in the early afternoon. Ralph was at the barn when the rider arrived, and he watched the man dismount with the particular ease of someone who is accustomed to arriving places and expecting to be received. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for a ranching area, with a gray felt hat and a suit jacket that looked too expensive for the dust of a Texas afternoon. He had the kind of face that would have been handsome once and was now merely commanding, with deep-set eyes and a jaw that suggested he was not in the habit of not getting what he wanted. Louise came out of the house before Ralph could make his way from the barn to intercept, if intercepting was something that was called for. "Mr. Farrow," Louise said from the porch with a tone that was neither warm nor rude, exact and level. So this was Gideon Farrow. Ralph slowed his walk and stayed near enough to hear without appearing to hover. "Miss Ralston," Farrow said, with a smile that showed a great deal of teeth. "You're looking well. Ranch life appears to suit you." "It does," Louise said, and there was something in the way she said those two words that was like watching someone plant a flag. "I heard you took on a new hand," Pharaoh said, glancing toward Ralph with an expression that managed to be both dismissive and assessing at the same time. "I did," Louise said. "What can I do for you, Mr. Pharaoh?" Pharaoh looked back at her with the easy confidence of a man who has rehearsed this particular conversation several times and considers the outcome settled. "I've come with an improved offer for the property, Miss Ralston. I think you'll find it very generous, more than fair, considering the current condition of the land." "The current condition of the land is improving," Louise said, "daily." "Of course," Pharaoh said smoothly. "But running a cattle operation requires capital and experience that I am acquiring," Louise said. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Pharaoh. As I told you the previous 3 times, I'm not interested in selling. The Ralston property is not for sale." Pharaoh's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "The offer won't remain on the table indefinitely," he said. "I understand that," Louise said. "Goodbye, Mr. Pharaoh." There was a pause that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable, and then Pharaoh replaced his hat, remounted his horse, and rode back down the drive without further comment. But he looked at Ralph as he passed, and the look was the kind that carries a message, and the message was, "This is not finished." Ralph went back to work without saying anything about it. But that evening at supper, Louise sat across from him at the kitchen table and said without preamble, "He's not going to stop." "No," Ralph agreed. "He wants the water rights," she said. "My father knew it. He told me before he died that the aquifer under this property is the most valuable thing on it, and that there would be men who would try to take it. He told me to hold on." Ralph looked at her. "Is that the only reason you're holding on?" She was quiet for a moment, in the way that she was quiet when she was thinking carefully about something. "No," she said finally. "It stopped being about what my father asked me to do somewhere around the 3rd day I spent pulling weeds in that south pasture. I don't know exactly when. But this place," she stopped. She looked at the window and the darkness beyond it and the faint shape of the land she could just barely see in the moonlight. "It started feeling like mine." Ralph nodded slowly. He understood that feeling completely. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Good. It's your land," he said. "It should feel like yours." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she looked back at her plate, and there was something in her expression that had shifted very slightly from what it had been before, a subtle opening, like a window unlatched on a warm day, barely noticeable but absolutely real. The 2nd month brought May in Texas, which means heat that is no longer apologizing for itself, and days that begin with the sky already lit like a forge. The berm along the north edge of the south pasture was finished, and within 3 weeks Ralph could already see the difference in the grass, less pooling, less weed growth, and the existing cattle grass coming back greener and thicker where it had been struggling before. He fixed the remaining fence gaps. He assessed the cattle herd, which was smaller than he had expected, 63 head, which was not enough for the size of the property, and he told Louise so. "I know," she said. "My father let the herd reduce over the past few years while he was ill. I need to build it back up, but that requires capital. There's good grazing on the east section that's going unused," he said. She looked at the map she had spread on the kitchen table between them, a hand-drawn thing her father had made, detailed and accurate, with all the water sources and fence lines marked. "If I brought in additional cattle to graze on a share basis," she said slowly, thinking out loud, "brought in other ranchers' animals for a portion of the grazing fee, built up revenue that way while I work on the herd itself." "That's exactly what I was going to suggest," Ralph said. She looked up at him with something that was almost amusement. "Were you going to let me get there myself?" "You were heading in the right direction," he said simply. This time she did smile, a real one, brief and bright, that changed the whole shape of her face. Ralph found himself hoping to see that smile again, and filed the feeling away to examine later, in the quiet of the bunkhouse, when the day was done, and he had a moment to think without the practical demands of the land pressing in from every side. They went to the cattle auction in Millhaven at the end of May, riding in together on the wagon in the early morning. Louise wore a dress that was more practical than decorative, in a sensible dark blue wool, with her hair pinned neatly and her good hat instead of the too large work hat. She looked different from how she looked in the field, but the same quality of focused attention was in her face. And when she walked into the auction yard and the men looked at her with the particular kind of skepticism that men in 1882 reserved for women who showed up to conduct business, she simply ignored them and studied the cattle with the same sharp assessment she gave to everything. She bought 4 good breeding heifers at what Ralph privately assessed as an excellent price, having talked the seller down with a calm, precise argument about their condition that had left the man slightly bewildered and considerably less money than he had planned to receive. Ralph arranged the transport and stood back and watched her work, and thought that the men in the silver spur had been wrong about her in every possible way. On the ride home, the sun going down ahead of them, turning the sky into something almost violent in its beauty, deep orange and burning pink, and a thin line of gold at the horizon, Louise sat beside him on the wagon seat with her hands folded in her lap and said, without looking at him, "Thank you for the past weeks." "You don't need to thank me for doing my job," he said. "I'm not thanking you for doing your job," she said. "I'm thanking you for doing it as if it matters. There's a difference." Ralph looked at her then, and she was looking at the sunset, and the light of it was on her face and in her hazel eyes, and he felt something move in his chest that he recognized, distantly, as the beginning of something large and slightly terrifying. "It does matter," he said quietly. She turned her head and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face, she held his gaze for a long moment before she turned back to the road ahead, and she said nothing else. But the silence that settled between them for the rest of the drive home was a different kind of silence than the one they had started with, warmer and more aware of itself. He lay in his bunk that night looking at the ceiling and listening to the Texas night, the crickets and the far-off coyotes and the occasional movement of the horses in the barn. And he thought about Louise Ralston with her books and her gloves and her streak of dirt and her too large hat and her refusal to be what anyone expected her to be. And he thought that he was, very probably, in considerable trouble. June arrived, and with it the first of the grazing arrangements Louise had worked out. A rancher named Thomas Beaumont, whose spread was 3 miles to the north and who had more cattle than good grazing land that season, brought 40 head onto the Ralston East pasture under an agreement that gave Louise a fair percentage of the grazing rights fee. It was good money, and it also meant that Ralph was substantially busier, managing the combined herd movement and making sure Beaumont's cattle stayed on the designated grazing areas. He did not mind the work. He liked being busy. He liked having something to show for each day when it ended. What he had not anticipated was that Thomas Beaumont would ride over personally to check on his cattle at least twice a week, and that on these visits he would spend a notable amount of time in conversation with Louise. Beaumont was a widower of 2 years, perhaps 40, with a straightforward pleasantness about him, and a genuine admiration for Louise's intelligence that he made no particular effort to conceal. Ralph noticed this without meaning to. He noticed the way Beaumont leaned on the fence and laughed at something Louise said. He noticed the way Louise smiled at Beaumont, a different smile than the brief, bright one she occasionally gave Ralph, more measured, more politely pleased. He noticed that Beaumont brought a small crate of preserved fruit from his wife's stores the second time he visited, as a gift, and that Louise received it graciously. None of this was any of Ralph's business. Louise Ralston was his employer and nothing else. He was very clear on this point with himself, and he was equally clear that being clear on this point was not preventing the situation from being one that required ongoing clarity. The thing that resolved it, or rather, the thing that accelerated everything, happened on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of June. Ralph was at the creek, checking the intake of the small irrigation channel he had been building to supplement the south pasture watering, when he heard something that made him go still. It was not loud. It was just wrong in the way that certain sounds in the natural world are wrong, a crack of branches in the wrong direction, a disturbance in the quality of the afternoon silence that suggested human presence where there shouldn't be any. He straightened and looked toward the east fence. There were two men on the other side of it, and they were not Beaumont's hands, and they were not anyone Ralph recognized. They were looking at the fence, and then they were looking at the post where one of the irrigation channels ran under the fence line, and one of them was pointing and the other was taking out a notebook and writing something down. Ralph walked toward them at a measured pace that was not quite confrontational but was absolutely intentional. "Something I can help you with," he called, while still 10 feet away. The two men looked up. The one with the notebook was younger, perhaps Ralph's age, with a nervous quality about him that suggested he was the assistant rather than the principal. The other was older and more deliberate about meeting Ralph's eyes. "Assessing the water features," the older one said without moving. "Hydrology survey." "For who?" Ralph asked. A pause. "Private client." "Private client have a name?" Ralph said. No answer, but the look that passed between the two men had a name in it as clearly as if they had spoken it. Ralph kept his expression neutral. "This is private property," he said. "I'll need you to move along." They moved along, but Ralph watched them go until they were fully out of sight, and then he went to find Louise. He found her in the barn, checking the condition of the newest heifer's feet, which the animal was enduring with supreme displeasure and considerable shifting of weight. Louise looked up when Ralph came in. "Pharaoh sent surveyors to the east fence line," Ralph said directly. She straightened. "What were they looking at?" "The irrigation channel, where the water runs under the fence." Louise's expression did exactly one of those things it occasionally did, a movement of emotion across her face that was too fast to categorize but entirely real, a flash of something between anger and concern. Then it settled back into the calm, assessing look that was her default. "He's mapping the water routes," she said. "That's what I think," Ralph agreed. "Which means he's either planning to make another offer and wants to know exactly what he's bidding on, or he's planning something else." She pulled off her work gloves. "I need to write to my lawyer in Dallas." "That's a good idea," Ralph said. "And until you hear back, I'd suggest you keep a closer eye on the east border. Not just the fence, the water course." She looked at him with the directness that she always brought to these conversations, the refusal to soften anything because it was uncomfortable. "You think he'd interfere with the water itself?" "I think Gideon Pharaoh is a man who has decided he's going to have what he wants," Ralph said carefully. "That makes him the kind of man who calculates what it would cost to take it rather than buy it." The air between them was suddenly very quiet. Outside, the June afternoon was alive with heat and birdsong and the slow movement of cattle in the distance, but in the barn there was just that quiet, and Louise looking at Ralph with an expression that had moved past the calculating and into something more fundamental. "I'm glad you're here," she said. It was not what she had intended to say, he could tell. It came out with a rawness that was very unlike her usual careful precision, and she seemed to hear it herself because something in her face shifted slightly, acknowledging it. Ralph looked at her for a moment. The light in the barn was soft and golden, and it fell across her face, and the loose strand of hair that had escaped from her pins, and the slight tension around her eyes that told him she was worried under the composure. And he said, with the same kind of unplanned honesty that she had just shown him, "So am I." They stayed in that moment for what was probably 3 seconds but felt considerably longer, and then Louise looked back at the heifer and said, in a voice that was almost back to its usual composed precision, "I'll write to Dallas this evening." "Good," Ralph said, and went back to his work. But something had shifted in the space between them, as definitively as the earth shifts when the underground water finally finds the crack it has been pressing against. Not dramatically, not with the noise and fuss of a thing being forced, but quietly and completely, and in a way that could not be undone. The letter went to Dallas. In the meantime, life on the ranch continued its rhythm, which was increasingly a rhythm that Ralph and Louise had built together, and that felt, to both of them, though neither of them was saying it, like something more than employer and employee. She had started bringing her books out to the porch in the evenings. He had started, without planning to, sitting on the porch steps with his journal in the evenings instead of staying in the bunkhouse. They would sit in companionable proximity with the Texas evening going purple around them, and eventually one of them would say something and they would talk, and the talking was the best part of Ralph's day. She told him about Philadelphia, about the school she had attended, which was one of the first in the city to offer women a full academic curriculum rather than a finishing curriculum, and about her father's quiet, steady pride in her and his refusal to tell her that education was wasted on a woman. About her mother, who had been less convinced but had loved her father too much to say so loudly. About the letter that had come, 6 months ago, telling her that her father was ill and had asked for her, and how she had packed a bag without hesitating. He told her about New Mexico, about his own father's small spread and the years of drought that had eventually broken it. About the rambling decade he had spent afterward, moving from ranch to ranch, learning everything he could from the land and the people who worked it. About the particular quality of early mornings in high desert country that he had never been able to stop missing, even when he was somewhere beautiful. About the way he had never quite settled, never quite found the place that felt like the right place, even when he'd spent months somewhere good. What would it take, she asked one evening, to feel like the right place? He looked at the land in the fading light, the grass moving, the enormous sky. The particular quality of the Ralston property, which had something in it, something that had nothing to do with the water rights or the grazing agreements or the economics of a cattle operation in 1882, something that was just the land itself, saying something he had been listening to since the first day he rode in. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I think it's not just the place." Louise was quiet beside him. She did not ask him to explain, but she also did not look away from where she was looking, which was at the same land he was looking at, and the side of her face in the evening light was a thing he was going to remember for the rest of his life whether he intended to or not. "I think that's probably true," she said softly. July came in hard and blazing and absolutely full of complications. The letter from the Dallas lawyer, a man named Gerald Whitfield who had handled Earl Ralston's estate, arrived in the second week. It was not good news and it was not bad news. It was complicated news. Whitfield wrote that while Louise's ownership of the property was not in legal question, there was an older land grant document that Gideon Farrow had apparently located and was claiming gave historical water rights in the county to a predecessor company that Farrow's holdings had since absorbed. This was almost certainly not a sustainable legal argument, Whitfield wrote, but it was the kind of argument that could take years to resolve and cost more than most small operators could afford to spend. Louise read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning and then set it down and sat very still for a moment, and Ralph, across from her with his coffee, waited. "He's going to try to bury me in legal costs," she said. "That's what it sounds like," Ralph agreed. "Can I counter it?" "Whitfield would know better than me," Ralph said, "but I think the question is also whether there are other options." She looked at him. "What kind of options?" "Other allies," he said. "Other people who have an interest in keeping Farrow from consolidating that much water control. If he gets this property's water rights, who else does that affect?" Louise thought about this. She was quiet for several minutes, which Ralph had learned was not discomfort but was in fact her deepest mode of thinking, the one that produced her best ideas. She got up and went to the shelf in the parlor where her father's papers were stored and came back with a county water usage document she had found and filed away weeks ago. She spread it on the table. "Beaumont," she said, pointing to a section on shared aquifer regions, "and the Alderman family, and at least 3 smaller farms. If Farrow gets control of the aquifer, they all pay whatever he asks for access." "Which means they might be willing to pay something to prevent that," Ralph said. She looked at him with that expression he had come to love, the one where her mind and her face were moving in the same direction fast. "A collective," she said. "A water rights cooperative." "Something like that," he said. "Get Whitfield involved, but also get Beaumont and the aldermans involved. Make this a broader legal and economic fight rather than just yours alone. Louise Ralston got up from the table, picked up the county document, picked up Whitfield's letter, and walked to the writing desk in the corner of the kitchen. "I need to write several letters," she said. "I know," Ralph said. "This is going to take time." "Good things do," he said. She paused at the desk and looked back at him. There was something in her face that was not the businesswoman, and not the rancher, and not the determined daughter holding on to her father's legacy. It was simpler than all of those things and more direct, and Ralph's heart moved in his chest with the particular motion of something that has been still for a long time suddenly remembering how to go. "Ralph," she said. "Louise," he said. She held his gaze. "Thank you, not for the specific thing, not just the advice." For she stopped, and for the first time since he had known her, she seemed to be having difficulty finding the right words, which was unusual enough to be notable. "For making this feel possible," she said finally. Ralph did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at her across the kitchen of the house that was becoming hers and the land that was becoming hers and the morning light that was falling through the window and catching the hazel of her eyes. "It is possible," he said, "and you're the one making it so." She turned back to the writing desk, but he could see the small curve of her mouth as she did, and that was enough. The letters went out. The response from Thomas Beaumont was swift and enthusiastic. He had been watching Pharaoh's moves with concern for some time, and the idea of a collective legal action appealed to him greatly. He wrote over 2 days after receiving Louise's letter, and the three of them sat around the kitchen table for 2 hours working through the details while the afternoon sun moved across the floor. Beaumont was good company and a clear thinker, and Ralph found himself revising his earlier, uncharitable feelings about the man's visits. Beaumont was not a rival, he realized. He was someone who saw Louise clearly and admired what he saw, which was entirely appropriate given what there was to see. The difference was that Ralph felt something in Louise's presence that he was quite sure was not what Beaumont felt, and he was quite sure, more recently, that whatever Louise felt in Ralph's presence was not what she felt when Beaumont was there. These were feelings. They required some management and some patience, and Ralph Dalton had spent 30 years developing both, so he managed and was patient and waited for the moment when circumstances would clarify themselves, as they generally did, for better or worse. The moment came in the 3rd week of July, at the end of a long day. They had been working the south pasture together all day, checking the berm they had built and assessing the progress of the grass recovery, and making adjustments to the small channels that directed the water away from the pasture's lowest points. It was close, physical work, the kind that leaves a person simultaneously exhausted and fully alive in every limb, and by the time the light began to flatten toward evening, they were both tired in the good and complete way that only comes from real labor. They had walked back toward the house along the east fence, and Louise had stopped to look at the land. She stopped like that sometimes, just stopped and looked, with a quality of attention that was almost reverent, and Ralph had learned to stop with her and look too, rather than walking on. The light was going gold and long across the grass. The cattle in the east pasture moved slowly in the distance, their dark shapes against the gold light, the particular sound of them, that low, constant movement that is one of the most fundamentally reassuring sounds in the world if you have grown up with it drifting across the evening air. "I used to think I was going to live in cities my whole life," Louise said. "Teach at a university, maybe." "Right. I had plans that were entirely interior, entirely constructed of ideas and words." Ralph stood beside her looking at the same view. "What changed?" "This," she said simply. "All of this, not just the land, though the land is—" She paused. "I can feel it, Ralph, the way it breathes. I could not have told you that was a thing that was possible before I came here." He was quiet beside her. He knew exactly what she meant. "I'm not going back to Philadelphia," she said. It did not sound like a statement she was making to him. It sounded like a statement she was making to herself, finally, with the weight of total commitment behind it, and he understood that it was something she had been working toward for a while and had finally arrived at. He looked at her. She was looking at the land. The evening light was everything. It was in her hair and on her cheekbones and in the hazel of her eyes when she finally turned and looked back at him. "I know," he said. And then, because he had been patient long enough and the patience was no longer adequate to the situation, he said, "I'm glad." She looked at him very directly, the way she always did, with that complete and unguarded attention. "Why?" she asked, and it was not a coy question and it was not a testing question. It was the honest question of a woman who wants an honest answer. "Because I'm not going anywhere either," he said. "If you'll have me." The words hung in the evening air between them, and Louise Ralston did not look away, and she did not hedge, and she did not produce a careful, measured response. What she did was step forward one step, which put her close enough that he could see the fine details of her face, the particular line of her brow, the slight unevenness of her lower lip, the way the evening light pooled in the angles of her cheekbones, and she said, "Is that what you want, to stay?" "Yes," he said. "Here. On this land. Wherever you are," he said, simply and completely, and the simplicity and completeness of it was what he meant, and she heard it in exactly the way it was meant. She reached up with one hand still calloused now from the weeks of work, and warm and entirely real, and touched the side of his face. Just touched it. And Ralph covered her hand with his, and they stood there in the evening light with the Texas summer going golden and vast around them. And then she kissed him. Or perhaps he kissed her. Or perhaps they moved toward each other simultaneously. Because after 2 months of proximity and honesty and work and laughter, and a kind of growing awareness that was like water seeking its level, it was simply the most natural thing in the world. When they drew back, she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before on her face. Open. Entirely open, with nothing measured or held back, and it was so different from her usual contained, assessing look that it struck him somewhere deep and immediate. "I'm not an easy person," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I'm not easy either. We might argue about the cattle management." "We already do," he pointed out. "And then we figure it out." She laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and the sound of it went out into the Texas evening like something released from a long confinement, and Ralph smiled in answer to it with an ease and openness that he had not felt in years. August was everything at once: the collective legal effort, the cattle operation, the ongoing work of the land, and the new and astonishing reality of loving Louise Ralston. Whitfield came from Dallas in the first week of August to meet with Louise and Beaumont and the Alderman brothers, Marcus and Leo, who had come in from their farm to the south with their own documentation about the water rights in the county. They sat in the Ralston parlor, which Louise had cleared of boxes and furnished properly with chairs brought in from the barn, and her father's good desk moved to the center, and Whitfield laid out the strategy. The historical water grant that Pharaoh was citing was real but largely symbolic. It predated state organization and had been superseded by subsequent county and state law, and Whitfield was confident that a proper legal filing would dispose of it. The more significant protection was a collective water rights declaration by all affected property owners in the aquifer region, which would create a formal legal structure for shared water use that Pharaoh could not simply override by acquiring one property. "It will cost something," Whitfield said. "Not dramatically, but something. Filing fees, my time, the time of the county registrar." "We'll share the cost proportionally by acreage," Louise said immediately, which Ralph had already known she was going to say because she had said it to him 2 nights before when they had gone through the numbers at the kitchen table. Beaumont agreed. The aldermans agreed. Whitfield began drafting documents. And Gideon Pharaoh, when the collective filing reached the county courthouse in Millhaven 2 weeks later, apparently received the news with somewhat less equanimity than he generally displayed. Because Hector Prout sent Ralph a note via the general store saying that Pharaoh had been heard in the Silver Spur, describing Louise Ralston in terms that were, in Hector's diplomatic phrasing, not especially complimentary. Ralph read this note and then showed it to Louise, because she was the kind of person who needed to be told things directly rather than protected from them. She read it, folded it, and set it down on the kitchen table. "Good," she said, in a tone of complete satisfaction. "Good," Ralph said. "It means he's frustrated," she said. "Frustrated men make mistakes. I would rather have him frustrated and predictable than calm and strategic." Ralph looked at her with undisguised admiration. "You have thought about this quite a bit." "I have thought about everything quite a bit," she said. "It's a primary characteristic of mine." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly. "I'm aware," he said. She turned her hand under his and held it. "Are you bothered by it?" "Never once," he said, and meant it completely. Pharaoh made exactly the mistake that Louise had predicted he would. In the third week of August, he had 3 of his hands ride the perimeter of the Ralston property at night, and they cut the east fence in 2 places and moved 17 of Beaumont's cattle off the east pasture into Pharaoh's territory. They might have gotten away with it if Beaumont had not come by the next morning as was his habit, and if Ralph had not gone to check the east pasture before breakfast as was his, and if the tracks in the morning dew had not been as clear as a printed page. Ralph found the cuts in the fence, found the tracks, went back to the house and told Louise. She was calm in the way that is not the same as peace. It is the calm of a person gathering themselves for something deliberate. She sent Ralph to Beaumont with the news and a note asking him to bring the county sheriff, a steady man named Arthur Clegg who had been doing the job for 12 years and was known for impartiality. She herself rode to town and straight to the courthouse, where she found Whitfield still in residence finishing the water rights documents, and she explained what had happened. What followed was not dramatic, in the way of the Wild West stories that were already being told about this era in the newspapers back east. There was no gunfight, no chase across the plains. There was Sheriff Clegg arriving at Pharaoh's property with a warrant and the tracks documented by 2 witnesses, and there was Pharaoh's hands being identified by the marks on the fence cuts, a specific size of wire cutter that left a distinctive edge, and there was Pharaoh himself, in the end, facing a legal situation that was considerably more uncomfortable than he had anticipated. He withdrew his claim on the water rights the following week. Whitfield filed the paperwork with commendable speed. Louise Ralston became, formally and permanently, the legal holder of the Ralston water rights, as part of the collective agreement that protected all the aquifer properties in the county. The evening after the final papers were signed, Louise sat on the porch with Ralph in the long August dusk and said nothing for a long time, and Ralph sat beside her and let the silence be what it was, which was a completion, the particular feeling of a thing that has been fought for arriving at the state of being one. "It's real," she said eventually. "It's real," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had not done before. They were still finding the shape of what they were to each other, still placing things carefully, and he put his arm around her and felt her lean into him, and the warmth of it was one of the best things he had experienced in 30 years of living. "My mother is coming in October," she said. "She wrote last week. I didn't tell you yet." "What does she know?" Ralph asked carefully. "About the legal situation. I told her in my letters." "About everything else." Louise paused. "She knows there is a ranch hand who has been indispensable." "Indispensable," he said. "That's a word." "It's the word I used because it is the accurate word," she said. "I am working up to other words." He looked down at the top of her head. "Take your time," he said gently. "I never take my time," she said with a hint of amusement. "But perhaps I will this once." September arrived and the terrible August heat began its slow retreat, giving way to mornings that had something crisp and promissory in them. The first suggestion of a Texas autumn that would be brief and beautiful before the next winter closed in. The grass in the south pasture was visibly improved from what it had been in April, and the berm was holding, and the east pasture was fully fenced and carrying 30 of Beaumont's cattle, alongside the expanded Ralston herd, which had grown with careful, selective purchasing to 81 head. Ralph watched Louise move through the days of September with something that was different from how she had moved in April. She still had the same focused determination, the same directness, the same refusal to stop when the work was hard. But she had also acquired something additional, something that was less rigid and more at home. She knew where things were without looking. She knew the cattle by habit and by sight. She knew which pasture had the sweetest water and which fence line was the most likely to need checking after a wind, and how the land felt in the morning compared to the evening, and 100 other small, accumulating things that make a person belong to a place. She belonged to this land now. Anyone who looked at her moving across it could see it. Ralph belonged to it too, though he had been more surprised than she was when he realized it. They were not coy about what they were to each other, but they were also not public about it in the way that would have invited comment and complication. It was simply understood between them, with the quiet, solid understanding of two people who have been honest with each other from nearly the beginning, and who have found that honesty builds something more durable than almost anything else. Margaret Ralston arrived on the 1st of October, on the afternoon stage from Abilene, and Louise went to town to meet her while Ralph stayed at the ranch and made sure everything was in its best order, which he had been doing for 3 days in preparation. He had not met Margaret Ralston yet, but he felt he knew something about her from the things Louise had said, a woman of considerable intelligence and social awareness, with genuine love for her daughter and genuine ambivalence about the choices her daughter was making, and enough grace to have held those two things alongside each other without forcing a crisis. He heard the wagon coming down the drive in the late afternoon and went to the yard to meet them. Louise climbed down first and came around the wagon with the practicality that was simply her way now, and he could see from 20 feet away that she had had a good journey with her mother, that there had been conversation and warmth in the wagon, and that she was nervous, which was unusual enough that he noticed it immediately. Margaret Ralston was a handsome woman of 52, with Louise's same dark hair gone partly silver and the same intelligent hazel eyes, and she descended from the wagon with the careful dignity of a woman who is taking everything in very precisely while appearing to take nothing in at all. She looked at Ralph for a long, steady moment. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "Louise has told me about your work here." "It's good work, ma'am," he said. "The land makes it easy to care about." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, barely, almost invisibly, but it was there. She looked from Ralph to Louise and back again, and whatever she was seeing it clearly. "I imagine it does," she said, and turned to survey the house and yard and barn and the vast quiet land stretching away in the autumn light. "It's beautiful," she said, and her voice was not what Ralph had expected. It was moved. She was genuinely moved. Louise took her mother's arm and guided her toward the house, and just before they reached the porch, Louise looked back at Ralph over her shoulder, and the look was entirely private and entirely warm, and he picked up her mother's bag from the back of the wagon and followed them inside. That evening's supper was the most elaborate Ralph had eaten since taking the position, because Louise had been cooking since early morning in between her regular work. A full roasted chicken from their own flock, with preserved vegetables and fresh cornbread, and a dried apple pie that had required considerably more effort than Louise let on. Ralph set the table and found he did not mind at all the domestic normality of it, the specific pleasure of a kitchen that smells like food and family. Margaret sat at the head of the table, Louise's insistence, and watched her daughter move around the kitchen with the barely concealed attention of a mother recalibrating everything she thought she knew about a person she has known all their life. Supper was warm and lively. Margaret was, as Louise had suggested, very intelligent, and the conversation ranged from the legal battle with Pharaoh, which Margaret had followed through letters with considerable pride in her daughter, to the cattle operation, to the nature of Texas Hill Country versus the Midwestern farmland Margaret was more familiar with, to the architecture of the house, which Earl Ralston had built himself over many years. Ralph was largely quiet through supper, contributing when directly asked, which Margaret did several times directly, and without the slightly testing quality some questions from mothers have. She asked him about his experience, about his assessment of the land's potential, about his history in New Mexico, with the particular interest of someone who had been reading the accounts of New Mexico territory with genuine attention. After supper, Margaret excused herself early, with the reasonable justification of a long journey and considerable tiredness, and went to the guest room that Louise had prepared. Ralph was washing the supper dishes at the basin. He had developed this habit of helping after meals, and Louise had ceased protesting about it after the first week, when Louise came to stand beside him and leaned against the counter with her arms folded and looked at him. "She likes you," she said. "She's reserving judgment," Ralph said. "My mother does not reserve judgment," Louise said. "She makes it immediately and then holds it for a period to see if the evidence changes. She made it at the wagon." Ralph looked at her. "What was it?" Louise looked at the window. "She told me when we were in the guest room just now that she understands. That is my mother's way of saying that she sees what I see." Ralph was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "What does she see?" Louise looked back at him. Directly, in that way she always looked at things, full and honest and entirely present. "The man I am in love with," she said simply. The words landed in the quiet kitchen like something that had been building for months finally completing its fall, and Ralph set down the dish he was holding and turned to face her fully, and she was looking at him with the same open expression she had shown him that evening in the field in July, nothing held back. Nothing managed or measured, simply Louise being entirely herself. "I love you," she said. And then, because she was Louise, she continued, "I should have said it before this. I was organizing my thoughts." "You have been organizing them for several months," Ralph said, and there was warmth in it, and she heard the warmth and her face did that thing, that opening. And then he said, "I love you, Louise Ralston. I have loved you since you looked at me over a pile of pulled weeds and asked me if I knew anything about drainage." She laughed at that, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and then he crossed the small distance between them and held her face in his hands gently, and kissed her in the warm lamplight of the kitchen with the Texas October, outside the window and her mother asleep down the hall, and the land that was hers, that was there stretching away in the dark toward the horizon. October deepened into a cool and golden month. Margaret Ralston stayed for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks she watched her daughter run a cattle operation with a competence and confidence that left no remaining ambiguity about whether Louise was going to stay or whether she belonged here. She watched Ralph and Louise together with the careful attention of a woman who loves her daughter and was paying close attention to whether she was loved in return. On the day before she was to leave for the stage back to Abilene, Margaret sat with Ralph on the porch in the afternoon while Louise was checking the cattle in the east pasture. "Mr. Dalton," Margaret said. "Ralph," he said. She looked at him. "Ralph," she agreed. "Tell me what you intend." He was not surprised by the directness. He had been expecting it, and he was glad it had come because he had things he wanted to say that he had been waiting for the right moment to say properly. "I intend to ask your daughter to marry me," he said. "She doesn't know that yet because I want to ask her the right way, but I want you to know before you leave, and I want to ask if you have any objection." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking at the land. "My late husband built this place," she said. "He gave everything to it. He wanted Louise to have it because he knew, even when she was in Philadelphia, that she had the best of him in her. He told me once that he hoped whoever she built her life with would understand the land the way she needed it understood." She looked at Ralph. "You understand it," she said. "That is not a small thing." "No," he agreed. "It is not." "Then you have no objection from me," Margaret said. "You have my support, Ralph, and more than that, you have my gratitude. Whatever she was building herself toward, you have helped her find the way there." Ralph looked at this woman who had raised Louise and felt the weight of what she had just given him and said she would have found it herself. Margaret smiled the same smile, he realized, the one Louise had, brief and bright and completely real. "Yes," she said, "she would have. But it's better that she didn't have to." Margaret Ralston left on the stage the next morning, and Louise stood in the road watching the coach until it went around the bend toward town, and then she turned back to the property with a look that was grief and resolve and love all at once, and Ralph was there beside her, and she leaned briefly against his arm, and then she squared her shoulders and said, "I need to check the south fence this morning. The wind last night was hard from the north." "I'll come with you," he said, and they went together. He asked her on a Saturday evening in late October, when the autumn had made the world go amber and gentle, and the air had the particular quality it gets in Texas when summer finally releases its grip, and something more forgiving moves in to take its place. He had planned it more carefully than was probably characteristic of him, and he had ridden to Millhaven 2 days before and visited the general store, which had a small glass case near the counter where a few pieces of jewelry were kept, not grand, not elaborate, but real, and among them a ring with a small garnet stone set in worked silver that caught the light with a warmth that reminded him immediately of Louise. He had bought it without agonizing over it. It was exactly right. He waited until after supper, when they were sitting on the porch in the last of the October evening, with the night coming in dark and cool and full of stars that were extraordinary in the Texas sky, and he said her name in the particular way that a name sounds when everything behind it is real. "Louise." She looked at him. He did not do it on one knee, because he was not that kind of man and she was not that kind of woman, and kneeling would have made it theatrical when what they were was honest. He reached into his shirt pocket and brought out the ring and held it in the palm of his hand between them and said, "I want to build this life with you. All of it, the land and the work and the mornings and the hard seasons and the good ones. I want to be here. I want to be yours. Will you marry me, Louise?" She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. There was a moment of that particular Louise Ralston stillness, and then she said, "Yes, Ralph. I will." And it was the most straightforward yes in the history of the word, and it was everything. He put the ring on her finger and she held her hand up and looked at it in the starlight, and then she looked at him with those hazel eyes that had been cataloging him from the first day, reading him with that complete and honest attention, and said, "It's exactly right." "I thought it was," he said. "You have good judgment," she said, with warmth that was also amusement. "I picked you as worth staying for," he said. "I'd say the evidence supports the conclusion." She laughed and leaned against him, and the stars over Texas were enormous, and the night was cool, and the land around them was theirs, and everything that had been moving toward this was finally, completely, joyfully arrived. They were married in December of 1882, in the small church in Millhaven that Ralph had not visited since riding in on that April morning 9 months earlier. It was a simple ceremony with the people who had become their community, Thomas Beaumont, who stood as Ralph's witness with genuine warmth, the Alderman brothers and their families, Hector Prout, who brought his wife and had the decency not to mention what he had told Ralph at the bar in April, and Margaret Ralston, who had come back from Abilene for the occasion, and who stood through the ceremony with a quality of composed joy that was very much her daughter's quality. Whitfield sent a letter and a fine bottle of wine from Dallas with his congratulations. Louise wore a dress of deep green wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in San Antonio, and she wore her hair in a way that was different from how she wore it for work, and she looked like herself in the finest possible version. And Ralph stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and felt the kind of clarity that comes when everything that has been scattered and searching suddenly knows exactly where it belongs. The winter was the good kind of hard, cold enough to keep the cattle settled, warm enough in the house with the iron stove going, and 2 people sharing the weight of the household, busy in the small daily ways that are the texture of a life well lived. They talked every evening about the operation and its needs and their plans, and also about things that had nothing to do with cattle management books Louise was reading, memories Ralph retrieved from his New Mexico years, ideas and questions, and the particular conversation that comes from 2 intelligent people who find each other perpetually interesting. In February, they got a letter from Margaret saying that her health was improved, and she was considering whether she wanted to remain in Abilene with her sister or perhaps. She left the perhaps very open and unspecified make some other arrangement. Louise wrote back, immediately inviting her mother to come and stay as long as she liked, which Ralph endorsed entirely. He liked Margaret Ralston and found her presence in the household a pleasure rather than a complication. Margaret arrived in March of 1883, on the cusp of a spring that was already showing its intentions in the way the ground was warming, and the first grass shoots were coming up in the south pasture. She arrived with 3 trunks and a traveling desk and a crate of her own books, and she moved into the guest room with the air of a woman who has made a decision and is completely at peace with it. She had, it emerged over the next several days, decided to stay indefinitely, not because she was dependent or unable to manage elsewhere, but because this was where the good things were: her daughter, her son-in-law, the land Earl had loved, and the beginning of whatever came next. What came next arrived in September. Louise had told Ralph in June with the characteristic directness he loved, had looked up from the book she was reading at the kitchen table one evening and said simply, "I believe I am going to have a child," and then gone back to the book for the space of exactly 1 second before looking up again and finding Ralph's face, and then doing something she had not done in front of him before, which was cry, quietly and fully and without apology, while smiling at the same time. He had come around the table and held her for a long time, and neither of them said much. And what they felt in that kitchen in June in Texas in 1883 was one of those things that has no adequate word and does not need one. The autumn was busy in every way, the cattle operation continuing its expansion, a second grazing agreement with a new neighbor to the west, the ongoing management of the land and its particular seasonal demands, and the waiting. Louise worked through the summer with the modification of activities that the situation required, and with the same stubbornness about stopping when there was work to be done that Ralph had come to expect. And he worked beside her, and they argued sometimes mildly about what was reasonable for her to be doing. And she was always partially right, and he was always partially right, and they found their way to the sensible middle each time. The child arrived in early September in the house, with the assistance of the Millhaven doctor and Margaret, who proved to be entirely calm and capable under the circumstances, which surprised no one who actually knew her. It was a boy. Ralph held his son in the September morning light, a dark-haired, furious, absolutely perfect boy, and felt something that had no bottom to it, something that went down past everything he could account for and into a place that was simply vast and quiet and full of wonder. Louise lay in the bed and watched him hold the baby, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it, more open even than the evening in the field or the kitchen in the lamplight, open in the way that only new life can make a person open, past all the competence and the precision and the determination and all the way down to the thing underneath all of it, which was love, enormous and unhesitating and absolutely real. "What shall we call him?" Ralph asked. "Earl," Louise said, without hesitation, and Ralph looked up from the baby's face, already looking back at him with the focused, bewildered attention of a brand new person encountering the world, and said, "Earl Dalton." "Earl Ralph Dalton," Louise said. Ralph looked at his son and felt the name settle over him like something that had always been waiting for the right shape to fill. "Earl Ralph Dalton," he said. The baby, apparently satisfied with this, went asleep. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was the warmest Ralph could remember in Texas, and it was full. Full of the baby, who was vigorous and loud and endlessly fascinating, and of Margaret, who turned out to have a completely unexpected talent for cattle management that emerged over the winter months, as she increasingly involved herself in the day-to-day decisions of the operation, and proved to have considerable instincts about the animals, instincts she had apparently inherited from Earl Ralston through years of marriage to him, and that had simply never had an outlet before. Ralph and Louise gave her increasing responsibility over the herd's health management, and she took it with the brisk competence of a woman who has been waiting some time for a real project to engage. Whitfield sent a final letter in November confirming that Pharaoh's claims against the water rights had been fully and permanently dismissed by the county court, and that the collective water rights agreement was registered and legally binding. Louise read this letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the box of important documents she kept on the shelf, and then went to feed the baby and did not comment further, because the outcome had always been the only one she intended, and additional comment on it seemed unnecessary. By the spring of 1884, the Ralston property, the Dalton Ranch, as people in Millhaven were beginning to call it, though Louise kept the Ralston name on the gate out of love for her father, was operating at a scale and efficiency that would have been unrecognizable from the struggling, weed-choked, gap-fence-spread Ralph had ridden in on 2 years before. The herd was at 120 head. The south pasture had been entirely reclaimed. The east pasture was running a profitable grazing business with 3 separate agreements. The berm was holding, the fences were solid, and the water the aquifer water, the source of so much conflict and so much determination, flowed freely and certainly under the land, protected and permanent. Earl Ralph Dalton took his first steps on a morning in April, in the kitchen, watched by both his parents and his grandmother and a working cattle dog named Pepper, who was the ranch's newest acquisition, and who treated the baby with the solemn, protective attention of someone who has accepted a very important assignment. He walked 3 steps toward Ralph, fell, looked at the floor with an expression of moderate outrage, and then pulled himself back up and walked 6 more steps to his mother, who caught him and held him up in the air and laughed with a fullness and freedom that went out through the open kitchen door and into the Texas spring, and was, as far as Ralph was concerned, the finest sound he had ever heard in 31 years of hearing things. Louise looked at Ralph across the kitchen, over their son's head, with the hazel eyes that still caught the light differently depending on where it came from, with the face that still registered its thoughts with such honest precision that he could read it like a map, with the expression that was entirely, permanently, without reservation, his, and he felt what he had felt on the first day he had not expected to feel anything. When he'd stood at the edge of the field and watched her pull weeds with the furious determination of a woman who intends to make something grow, he had been told she would never settle for a ranch life. He had ridden in ready to take that at face value, ready to find a temporary employer, a temporary position, another of the stops in a life that had been full of stops and no real arrival. Instead, he had found her knee-deep in the field, already arrived, already belonging to the land in the way that only real love makes a person belong to a place. And then, somehow, through the weeks and the months and the work and the honesty and the space that 2 people create between them when they are neither one afraid of the truth, she had found him and he had found her, and the land had found both of them, and it had become something none of it had been before, which was home. Ralph Dalton walked across the kitchen and took his son from his wife's arms and settled the boy on his hip, and Louise stepped close and leaned against him, and Margaret Ralston watched the 3 of them from the doorway with the quiet, settled happiness of a woman who has seen her best hopes made real. And outside the window of the kitchen of the house Earl Ralston had built with his own hands. The Texas spring was doing what it always did, coming on with its particular combination of blazing and beautiful, relentless and generous, demanding and full of everything worth staying for. 2 years after young Earl's first steps in the spring of 1886, Louise told Ralph on a Tuesday morning over coffee that she believed there was going to be a second child. He set down his cup, reached across the table and took her hand, and she looked at him with that completely open expression and said, "I think this one will be a girl." "Do you?" he said. "It's a feeling," she said. though I am generally not a person who operates on feelings." "You operate on feelings all the time," he said. "You've just trained yourself to run them through a very thorough analytical process before you act on them." She considered this. "That is an accurate characterization," she said. She was right, as it happened. The baby that arrived in October of 1886 was a girl dark-eyed and fierce, with a grip that immediately suggested she had her mother's fundamental quality of refusing to let go of things once she had hold of them. They named her Clara Margaret Dalton, the Margaret for Louise's mother, who wept without restraint when she was told, which was the second time Ralph had ever seen Margaret Ralston cry. Earl, who was 3, examined his new sister with the particular gravity of a child who has just been asked to accept a significant change to his understanding of the world, and then he reached out and very carefully touched her hand with one finger and apparently found her acceptable, because he looked up at Ralph and said, in the serious way of a 3-year-old delivering an important judgment, "She's very small." "She'll grow," Ralph said. "Like the cattle," Earl said. "Just about exactly like that," Ralph agreed, and Louise from the bed made a sound that was half exhaustion and entirely laughter. The ranch grew too. By 1887, they had enough cattle to justify taking a herd to the San Antonio market, the first of what became an annual journey that Ralph and Louise made together, alternating each year who rode and who stayed with the children and Margaret. The San Antonio Trail was well worn by then, and the journey was several days each way, and it was on the return from the first of these trips, riding side by side in the late afternoon with San Antonio behind them and the hill country ahead, that Louise said something Ralph had been thinking for a while. "This is the life I want," she said, not as a declaration, not as a conclusion she was arriving at. As a simple statement of fact, the way she would say the pasture needs water or the east fence needs checking. This specific life, I could not have designed it more correctly if I had tried. Ralph rode beside her, and the Texas afternoon went long around them, and he thought about the years he had spent moving from place to place, and the April morning in Millhaven when he had sat at the bar, and heard about a woman who would never settle for ranch life. And he thought about what he had found when he rode out to the Ralston property and the field and the woman knee-deep in the grass, already claiming what was hers. "Neither could I," he said. She looked at him with those hazel eyes, exactly as she had looked at him from the first day, directly, fully, holding nothing back. And she smiled. Not the small, brief smile she gave to things she approved of, and not the open laugh she gave to things that delighted her, but something that contained both and more besides, something that was particular to him, that he had learned to read as his, that he had been the beneficiary of every day for 5 years, and that he fully intended to be the beneficiary of for every year that came after. They rode home through the golden Texas afternoon, toward the land and the children and the grandmother and the working dog, and the cattle and the berm along the south pasture, and the aquifer protected by its collective agreement, and the iron R on the gate, and the kitchen where the coffee was always on, and the porch where the evenings were always worth sitting through, and everything that had been searching was found, and everything that had been a question had its answer, and the story of Ralph Dalton and Louise Ralston, which had begun with a horse and a gate and a field and a woman knee-deep in the grass, was not finished. It was simply itself, living and continuing and better with every year, the way good land is, the way good love is, going on and going forward and rich with everything still to come.